when we're good to go.
Okay, we're good. Sue.
All right. Well, having spent 2 weeks in Israel, and it was primarily an archaeological tour. I guess there are a lot of ways to travel through Israel, and a lot of people do, kind of their own or church-led pilgrimages or whatever. This tour happened to have a strong biblical archaeological focus. And my brother, who kind of puts these tours together, does an amazing job of explaining when you're standing in a desert area looking at a pile of rocks, as his wife calls it. Oh, John, it's just a pile of rocks. He does a great job of explaining why that pile of rocks is important and who might have lived on that pile of rocks. And it really is quite an amazing with this whole list of, oh my gosh, this would be fun to teach, this would be fun to teach. But we had kind of committed ourselves previously in this group to focusing on the Old Testament because that seemed to be where a lot of curiosity was. And so tonight I want to talk about Abraham and Isaac. So if you have your iPad or phone tuned into the REV, the STF website, bookmark Genesis 22. If you're just looking at a, doesn't matter, put one of those little ribbon markers in Genesis 22 or open it to Genesis 22. And you could also bookmark Hebrews 11. But don't read ahead. So I really wrestled with how to pull this teaching together because Abraham is, I'm not going to get through this with a dry eye. Abraham is a precious, precious man of faith. And he essentially sort of came out of nowhere. I mean, he was just a man who was so hungry to know his God, Yahweh. So we'll start in Genesis 22. So by this time, Genesis 22, Abraham is like 130 years old. So it came to pass after these things, that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, now take your son, your only son, whom you love, all these phrases of emphasis, Isaac, and go into the land of Moriah and offer him there, Isaac, as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will point out to you. What a loaded verse. So hold that thought, and I'm going to give you a nutshell narrative of who Isaac was and what it took for Isaac to arrive. And then also we'll catch up with the land of Moriah. But so, okay, at this point, Genesis 22, Abraham is about 30 years old. Well, how did Isaac, your only son whom you love? So the story goes like this. And if I'm just gonna rip through it verbally, but it occurred to me, because this night would be awfully long if I went through it at length, but it occurred to me that if you want to do that like next month or so, I'm more than happy to go all the way back and just catch up. It's so rich. Genesis 12 is where God first spoke to Abraham and gave him the promise of two things: land, an area of land, and a multitude of descendants. And the promise talked about nations will arise out of you, and you're going to own this land, which was at that time called Canaan. And I can't emphasize enough to read the Old Testament alongside some kind of a Bible atlas. If your Bible has maps in the front or the back, use them. If the Oxford Bible Atlas by the Oxford University Press, it's been in print for, I don't know, 50 years. It's a fabulous resource, but I can't read the Old Testament without an atlas that tells me where all these things are going. Uh-oh, geez. I hope we're not having difficulty here. Can you guys see that pop up messages? No? Good.
No, but you know, I did give a few people the phone number to call, so I was just looking to see if somebody was on, but
Yeah, I don't think that
No.
was what it was. Well, anyway, so, oh gosh. Okay, Father, take care of that stuff. That, oh, I don't know. Anyway, so
is on, make sure is everybody on mute? Sorry to interrupt you.
I think so.
Okay, just so everybody's on mute, then you're not hearing anybody, any noises. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so in Genesis 12 is when God first spoke and gave Abraham the promise of a land and a people. Okay, understand, this is about 1880 BC. So in Genesis 12, we're already essentially 2,000 years into the history of mankind. You know, we're 2,000 years after Adam. And the land of Canaan, as it's called, is what is Israel now, or what is Israel after Joshua conquered it. And Abraham is 75 and childless. And God is saying, but you're going to own all this land and you're going to have all these descendants. Okay, so then he says it again, the next chapter, Genesis 13, the promise comes again, still no children. Then in Genesis 15, God embellishes the promise by saying, oh, but these descendants are going to be from your lineage, from your flesh. And because when God said it again, Abraham said, why are you telling me this? That my heir is the oldest son of my top servant, which was culturally accurate and valid. And Abraham's hearing this promise from God, and he's saying, okay, God, surely you're aware that I don't have any kids, and the person who is going to inherit everything I own, and Abraham was wealthy and powerful. That he's the son of a servant, and culturally that would have been the right thing to do. So then in Genesis 16, this is the most precious thing, because now it's 10 years after God first called Abraham and gave him that promise, and still there's no child. And by this time, Abraham is 85, Sarah's 76. And they're thinking about this, and Sarah says, take my servant Hagar, go into her, and we'll have an heir. And you know, that piece of scripture, that story is highly criticized as a departure from faith on behalf of Abraham and Sarah. I vehemently disagree with that. I believe that it'd been 10 years since the promise. They weren't giving up. Everything in their realm, their awareness, their knowing said, we're too old. But a way to get this done, a way to fulfill what God was saying, was to have Sarah's servant Hagar give birth to Abraham's child. And then in the custom of the time, that child legally would have been Sarah's. So with the information that God had told them to this point, that was a perfectly logical conclusion and action to take. And so they did. And lo and behold, Hagar, of course, gets pregnant right away. which made Sarah a little bit jealous. And Ishmael was born. After that, God speaks to Abraham again, and he says, well, it's actually going to be Sarah's child. And Abraham laughed, because at that time, you know, Sarah was, let's see, Sarah was 90, he was 99. And he's like, oh, okay, how is this going to happen? But that was the first time that God had said specifically, no, it's not only going to be your line, it's going to be Sarah's line too. And then there's this whole beautiful thing about God actually comes to Abraham in human form with two angels. Abraham makes this huge feast for them, and he says, it's a year from now that you're going to have this child. And Sarah's in the tent laughing. And then God says, well, yeah, why was she laughing? And Sarah, I didn't laugh. And God said, well, yeah, you laughed. I heard you. Anyway, so a year later, Isaac was born of Abraham and Sarah, just as God said it would. So this was a 20-year journey of faith and unfolding. So by the time we get to Genesis 2, Isaac is 30, Abraham is 130, and God says to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. By the way, this is the son you waited 20 years for. This is the son that I said would be the promised line of the Messiah, and offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I'm going to show you. Okay. And as it turns out, the land of Moriah, Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives are part of the land of Moriah. It's a mountain range. Israel is like all mountain. It's just mountain range after mountain range after mountain range. And they had a funny way of naming, like we would talk about the Moriah Range. They would talk about Mount Moriah, but it means the same thing. They would talk about the Mount of Megiddo, but it's really, there's a range of Megiddo mountains. Anyway, and if you look at a topographical map, once you get a hold of a good atlas, Israel is really, really mountainous, and the mountains are steep. Right around Jerusalem, they're not particularly high, maybe a couple thousand feet. But Moriah is where Jerusalem would be in the future, and part of the mountains of the Moriah range is the Mount of Olives. And there's pretty strong biblical, scriptural support for the fact that where Abraham went to offer Isaac was the Mount of Olives. But he didn't know. He just said, you just go up to the Moriah area, and I'm going to point out where you go. And it wasn't the first time that kind of direction had happened. When Abraham first came down into the promised land, God just said something to the effect of start walking, and I'll show you when you get close. Really just an incredible testimony of faith. So in verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, which means he threw a blanket on its back, and took 2 of his young men, servants, and Isaac, his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went to the place that God had told him of, and went toward the place, I think is better. Where Abraham was when he got this message was about 35 miles south of the Moriah Mountains. So three plus days walking if they covered about 10 miles a day, even, you know, and they weren't all on donkey back. Some of them were walking. So, and the wood for a burnt offering to burn a human is not just a little pile of kindling. It was significant weight and volume. And verse 4, on the third day, and pay attention to that, Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw the place in the distance, meaning he recognized it. God had, you know, God worked in his spirit to say that that's the spot. And then Abraham said to the young men, the two servants who were with him, stay here with the donkey while the boy and I, boy, who's 30, go over there and bow down and worship and then come back to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. Like, here, you carry this. And he took in his own hand the fire, which was obviously something already burning, like kindling, or, you know, maybe it was contained in an earthen pot or something like that, and the knife. And the two of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, well, here's the fire and here's the wood. Where's the lamb? What a wonderful, I mean, it was, yeah, why wouldn't you be asking that, right? And Abraham said, God will himself see to providing the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And there's several verses in this section, and I'll point them out as we read through, that have multiple fulfillments. And because I strongly believe, and I believe there's good evidence for this, that where they were going to do this is on the top of the Mount of Olives, that this statement that God will see to providing the lamb has at least two fulfillments. And so they went both together. And they came to the place that God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, which was, you know, would have taken some time, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar and on the wood. Now, Abraham's 130, Isaac is 30. Isaac did that willingly. You know, Abraham is not going to forcefully bind a 30-year-old. It's just a picture of the beautiful, it's a willing father and a willing son. So here goes Isaac laying down because his father said to. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And the angel of Yahweh called out to him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not reach out your hand toward the boy. Don't do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son, your only son. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked and saw that behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering instead of his son. And I love this detail because Abraham had said God will provide a lamb, which is a reference to age, not gender. And what God provided was a ram, which is a reference to gender, not age. So the ram was a male lamb. Abraham called the name of that place, Yahweh will provide. As it is said to this day, on Yahweh's mountain it will be provided. When last time we were together and we talked about the reasons why to study the Old Testament, one of those reasons was because This was Jesus' manual for life. This was how he learned who he was and what he needed to do. And in this picture is a beautiful, willing father, loving but willing, and a willing, loving, obedient son, willing to do this thing that God had asked. That's what Jesus read. And on Yahweh's mountain, it will be provided. And one of the reasons I believe this is the Mount of Olives, well, first of all, there's archaeological evidence and biblical scriptural evidence to support that. But we believe that Jesus was crucified on the Mount of Olives. It's a highly visible place. It was a crossroads. It was, I mean, there were a lot of reasons in the Roman culture why you would do that on the Mount of Olives. But I think on Yahweh's mountain, that lamb was provided. And Jesus read this, and he understood. So anyway, verse 15, the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time out of heaven. And now here's a point too about, if you really go back to Genesis 12 and you read all the way through Genesis, you get a really strong sense of how close Abraham was to his God. And I mean, everywhere he said, Abraham was a nomad. He was, think of him as, he lived in tents. He was extremely wealthy. He had a huge family, lots of servants, lots of herds, and he traveled a lot. But everywhere he went, he built an altar. Everywhere he went, he worshiped. And God talked to Abraham often. And God even appeared to Abraham in human form several times. I think that whole 3-day journey, when Isaac was essentially as good as dead, that angel was right there. Just really, you know, he wasn't way far away and having to go, wait, don't put down the knife. You know, I think he was just right there. And so he called to him again a second time, and he said, I've sworn by myself, says Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, that I will bless you, yes, bless you, and I will make your seed many, yes, many, like the stars of heaven and like the sand that is on the seashore, and your seed will possess the gate of his enemies. And I think that statement, your seed will possess the gate of his enemies, is one of those prophecies that has multiple fulfillments. It certainly had fulfillment in the time moving into the promised land. It will have its ultimate fulfillment after Armageddon, when Jesus sets up his millennial kingdom and rules over the earth for 1,000 years. And then he says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. And that's again a reference to the Messiah, who will ultimately bless all the nations of the earth, those who have believed. So it's just a wonderful typifying of who Christ is. And this is part of the picture that Christ read to understand who he was, who his Father was, and what he needed to do. And then I love this in verse 19. Then he went home. I just think it's just so fun. It's like, okay, message over. Then Abraham returned home, and he lived in Beersheba, which is a very, very southern part of Israel. But if you bookmarked it, great. Hop over to Hebrews 11. If you didn't, you can flip through whatever device you have, if it's an iPad or a physical, a Bible or whatever, to Hebrews 11. Kind of wave when you're there. Are you there? Okay. All right. So in Hebrews 11, verse 8, this kind of gives you a picture of the history of this a few, 1,000 years later. You may be reading a version that says by faith. The REV that I'm reading from says by trust, because faith is actually trust. That's what it is. By trust, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place that he was about to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By trust, he went to live in the promised land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city that has lasting foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And of course, that city is the New Jerusalem that is way, after the millennial kingdom, after the hugest battle of all battles, and when the earth is renewed and refreshed, the city of Jerusalem actually comes down out of heaven and rests on the Temple Mount, which is across a valley from the Mount of Olives. By trust, even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she counted him faithful who had promised. And so from one man, and him as good as dead, and I think that's referring to Isaac, he was as good as dead for that 3-day walk, because Abraham was going to do what God said to do. As many were born, as many as the stars in heaven in multitude, and as innumerable as the sand that is by the seashore. And then skip down to verse 17. By trust, Abraham, being tested, offered up Isaac. Yes, he who had gladly received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Even he to whom it was said, in Isaac will your seed be called. So he was willing, even though he knew it was the line of the Messiah. And he had Ishmael, but Isaac was it, and he knew it was it. He was still willing to trust, because in verse 19, he reasoned that God was able to raise him up even out from among the dead, which as a parable he did receive him back. And this to me is so incredibly remarkable. Genesis doesn't say that Isaac did this because he knew that God would raise him from the dead. But here we have it. And there had not been anyone raised from the dead before that. So it's a picture of how tight and how tender the relationship was between God and Abraham. That he knew Isaac was the seed of the ancestor of the Messiah. He knew that the Messiah was going to come out of the line of Isaac. So why, if God is asking me to sacrifice him, he must be going to get him up. I mean, to me, it's just amazing that he realized that when it had never happened before. I don't know. It's just an amazing, tender record of God's love and God's calling and God's promise, and then our capacity to respond to it. And to understand that Jesus needed that. He needed that in writing. So,
So we can all unmute ourselves now?
yeah, unmute. Let's chat away.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to stop the recording at this point, Carol,
Yeah,
or
I can do that.
okay.